Okay, get ready to dive into a topic that might surprise you. Homelessness in Chile.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
I know what you're thinking. Chile, that South American nation known for its economic growth.
We often associate Chile with economic success, even calling it the Jaguar of South America. But the reality is far more complex.
And you wouldn't be wrong. But here's the thing. Even before the pandemic shook things up, Chile was grappling with a growing homeless population, a silent crisis simmering beneath the surface of prosperity.
And that's what we're here to unpack today. We've got a stack of sources for you, reports from the Chilean government itself, data from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, studies from leading universities, and even firsthand accounts from social workers on the ground. We're talking about the human impact of this crisis.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to unpack today. We've got a stack of sources for you, reports from the Chilean government itself, data from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, studies from leading universities, and even firsthand accounts from social workers on the ground.
And that multifaceted perspective is key. By piecing together these different viewpoints, we can get a clearer picture of how the pandemic impacted homelessness in Chile and what lessons we can learn from it.
So imagine this. It's early 2020, pre-pandemic, and Chile's already seeing this rise in homelessness. Official government numbers put the figure around 15,500 individuals. But get this, social workers on the ground were reporting a number almost double that.
It's a classic case of what we call hidden homelessness.
They were saying the real figure was likely closer to 30,000.
Official counts often rely on these single-night snapshots, literally counting who's visible on the streets on a given night. Naturally, this misses a significant portion of the homeless population: families tucked away in overcrowded homes, individuals sleeping in cars, people seeking shelter in more secluded areas. It's a huge issue because when you're working with incomplete data, addressing the problem becomes that much harder.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Yeah.
But let's back up for a moment. You mentioned Chile's booming economy. Can you paint a picture for our listener of what was happening in Chile at that time? What led to this surge in homelessness even before the pandemic hit?
Picture a country with stunning natural beauty, from the towering Andes Mountains to the Atacama Desert.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Now envision bustling cities, a rapidly growing economy, and you wouldn't be wrong. Chile's economy had been experiencing steady growth for years, fueled by exports of copper, wine, and salmon. However, here's the catch. That economic growth came with a hefty price tag for some.
Wow, so even with economic growth, a significant portion of the population was struggling to keep up with the cost of living.
Well, while Chile was busy climbing the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations, housing costs were skyrocketing, particularly in urban areas like Santiago, the capital. Imagine trying to find an affordable apartment in a city where rents are rivaling those of some European capitals. That was the reality for many Chileans. And that's a trend we're seeing in many parts of the world, not just Chile. It's almost like this hidden consequence of economic progress where the benefits aren't always trickling down to everyone equally.
Right, so you have this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that gap was becoming glaringly obvious in Chile's housing market.
Exactly. This issue of housing affordability, or rather, the lack thereof, coupled with deeply rooted economic inequality and a shortage of affordable housing options, created a perfect storm. Imagine trying to make ends meet on a minimum wage that barely covers a fraction of your rent. That was the reality for many Chileans. And then, just as things were reaching a boiling point, the pandemic hit, and that's where things took a turn for the worse.
Okay, so we've got this pre-existing housing crisis in Chile, fueled by inequality and sky-high costs, and then bam, the pandemic hits.
Yeah.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. What happened next?
It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, to be honest. You had a society already grappling with these deep-seated economic vulnerabilities, and then the pandemic swept through, causing mass layoff and financial instability.
And I imagine for those already living on the edge, even a small drop in income could be devastating.
In Chile, the unemployment rate shot up to a staggering 12.9% in 2020. To put that into perspective, that's like over 1 million people suddenly finding themselves without a paycheck.
1 million people. That's a number that's hard to even wrap your head around.
Absolutely. Many families were already stretched incredibly thin, relying on informal work, multiple jobs, whatever they could find just to keep their heads above water. When the pandemic hit, those lifelines, those safety nets, they vanished practically overnight.
Our sources mention that Chile's GDP, its economic output, also took a significant hit during this time. It wasn't just individual families feeling the pinch, it was the entire nation.
That's right. The Chilean economy contracted by almost 6% in 2020. To put that into simpler terms, it's like the entire country took a massive pay cut. And as we know, when economic downturns happen, they don't impact everyone equally. It's always the most vulnerable who bear the brunt of it.
It's like this perfect storm brewing a pre-existing homelessness crisis exacerbated by a global pandemic and a shrinking economy. Did this translate to a visible increase in homelessness on the ground? What were people seeing in the streets of Chile's cities?
The change was impossible to ignore. In cities like Santiago, a bustling metropolis once considered a symbol of Chile's economic success, you started to see a heart-wrenching sight. Families forced out of their homes, seeking shelter in public spaces, often in makeshift camps. It was a stark visual reminder of the pandemic's devastating human toll.
That's heartbreaking.
Imagine walking through a park where children once played, and now you see families huddled under tarps and blankets, their belongings scattered around them. That was the reality in Chile.
One of our sources, a report from a leading Chilean university, estimated that the true number of homeless individuals could be as high as 40,000 by 2021. That's a staggering increase from the pre-pandemic estimates, even the unofficial ones.
And even that number is likely a significant undercount. Remember our discussion about hidden homelessness. The pandemic, in a way, forced this issue into the spotlight. It made it impossible to ignore the true scale of the problem, even if official statistics couldn't fully capture it.
It's tragic that it took a crisis of this magnitude to expose the extent of the problem. But this wasn't just a Chilean phenomenon, was it? Were other countries experiencing similar trends? Were they seeing a rise in homelessness during the pandemic?
Sadly, yes. The pandemic exposed the fragility of social safety nets worldwide. We saw a rise in homelessness not just in Chile, but also in affluent nations like the United States, Canada, and across Europe. This was a global crisis playing out on local scales, highlighting the interconnectedness of our world and the shared challenges we face.
It makes you realize that no country is immune to these issues, no matter how prosperous they may seem on the surface. So, facing this growing crisis, what was the Chilean government's response? How did they attempt to address this surge in homelessness?
Well, it's important to acknowledge that the Chilean government did take action. They implemented initiatives like the Winter Plan, which aimed to provide temporary lodging and basic services to those experiencing homelessness during the coldest months of the year.
That sounds like a step in the right direction, at least providing some respite from the harsh elements. Was it enough to make a real difference? Did it reach those who needed it most?
The Winter Plan undoubtedly provided some relief, offering a warm meal and a place to sleep out of the cold. But like many well-intentioned programs, it faced limitations.
So, a Band-Aid solution, rather than a cure for a complex problem.
Often, there were more people in need than available spaces, leading to long lines and heartbreaking scenes of families being turned away. And crucially, the program was, by design, temporary. It didn't address the root causes of homelessness, the lack of affordable housing, the economic inequality, the systemic issues that were driving people onto the streets in the first place.
Did they implement any other programs that tried to tackle the issue more systemically?
They did. Alongside the Winter Plan, the government also launched the Neighborhood Recovery Program. Now, this initiative was interesting because it took a more community-based approach.
Oh, tell me more about that. A community-based approach to tackling homelessness. How did that work in practice?
Essentially, the Neighborhood Recovery Program encouraged residents, community organizations, and local businesses to play a more active role in supporting those experiencing homelessness. It was about fostering empathy, breaking down stigmas, and creating a sense of shared responsibility.
It's a really interesting approach, trying to create solutions from the ground up, tapping into that sense of community. Did it work? Did it actually make a difference?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest.
Okay.
On the one hand, the Neighborhood Recovery Program did have some notable successes. There's a fascinating case study in our research about a community in Valparaiso, a coastal city known for its vibrant art scene. There, residents and local businesses came together to create a pop-up market where those experiencing homelessness could sell crafts, food, or offer services. It provided a source of income, reduced stigma, and fostered a sense of belonging.
That's incredible. A real testament to the power of community action. But you said it was a mixed bag. What were some of the challenges this program faced?
Well, for starters, replicating the success of the Valparaiso market proved difficult in other areas. Many communities lacked the resources, social capital, or, frankly, the political will to implement such initiatives effectively. It also raised some fundamental questions about fairness and responsibility. Was it truly equitable to place the burden of solving such a complex systemic issue like homelessness solely on the shoulders of already stretched communities?
It's like asking someone to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. They might make a difference in their little corner, but it's not going to solve the larger problem. Our sources also pointed out a rather glaring contradiction in the Chilean government's response. Even as they were launching these initiatives, the Winter Plan and the Neighborhood Recovery Program, resources allocated to combat homelessness were actually being reduced. What's going on there?
Ah, yes. That's a crucial point and a classic dilemma in social policy. While Chilean government was making public commitments to address the issue, even launching these programs, they were simultaneously grappling with budget constraints, economic pressures, and competing priorities. It highlights the gap that often exists between rhetoric and reality, between good intentions and concrete action.
It's a reminder that tackling complex social problems requires more than just words. It demands sustained commitment and adequate investment. But even with limited resources and support, people are incredibly resilient. Our sources mention that Chilean households, particularly those already struggling in urban poverty, came up with some incredibly creative ways to cope during those difficult times.
It's true, isn't it? Necessity truly is the mother of invention. We saw families adapting in remarkable ways, taking on additional work, often in the informal economy, to make ends meet. Imagine juggling multiple jobs, often physically demanding or precarious, with no safety net or benefits just to put food on the table.
It speaks volumes about the human capacity for resilience, but it also underscores the harsh realities faced by those living on the margins. What other coping mechanisms did they employ?
Many families were forced to adjust their consumption patterns, making difficult choices about what to prioritize. They cut back on essential items, sometimes even foregoing things like healthcare or education, to stretch their meager resources as far as possible. While understandable in the short term, these choices often have lasting consequences.
It's a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes even the best coping mechanisms are really just survival tactics, with potentially hidden costs down the line. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Chile's homelessness crisis, what are the key takeaways you want to leave our listener with?
Well, on a broader level, the situation in Chile serves as a potent microcosm of global trends. The pandemic didn't create these social and economic vulnerabilities. It merely amplified them, exposing the cracks in our social safety nets and the persistence of inequality.
It ripped the Band-Aid off, revealing the wounds beneath.
Exactly. And in doing so, it forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our priorities, our values, and the kind of society we want to live in. It also underscored the need for more robust social safety nets, for policies that address the root causes of homelessness, and for a greater sense of collective responsibility.
It feels like we're left with more questions than answers, but perhaps that's the point. What happens next? Will these short-term coping mechanisms have any lasting positive effects, or will they lead to deeper economic hardship down the line?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and unfortunately, they don't have easy answers. What we do know is this. We can't afford to wait for another crisis to spur us into action. The time to address these issues is now. We need to invest in affordable housing, ensure access to quality education and healthcare, and create an economy that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. The path forward requires a fundamental shift in our thinking, a recognition that we are all interconnected, and that the well-being of our society depends on the well-being of its most vulnerable members.
It's a powerful message, and one that resonates deeply. As we conclude this deep dive into Chile's homelessness crisis, we're left with a sense of urgency, a call to action for all of us. We can't turn away from these uncomfortable truths. It's time to engage in meaningful dialogue, challenge our assumptions, and work together to create a more just and equitable world.